Hola, carnals and Stars fans, and welcome to an edition of Stars Stuff featuring Stars Thoughts. I guess. I mean, that's not really a catchy title, but we'll go with that for now. And so a lot of the Stars news recently has not been very, hasn't been like the most unexpected. There were some unexpected moments, like the Bishop news, we'll get to. But there have been some things, but for the most part, for example, we know exactly who the Stars were going to protect, and yeah, so not a lot, going on, and not really anything of special note. But this is the internet, and if you're online, one of the a valuable asset, or I should say, a virtue to being online is to dramatically overreact, and so. I'm not really going to dramatically overreact, but let's just pretend to make a big deal about some stuff. And let's talk about, let's just kind of get right into it. Excuse me. And talk about the Jason Dickinson trade, which the All-Stars traded Jason Dickinson to the Vancouver Canucks for a third-round pick, which I wasn't a fan of. Again, in a vacuum, it's not really a big deal. But I do think it reflects a lot about Stars' philosophies in subtle ways. Like I said, I can't stress this enough. This is not a big deal, and I don't think it should be made a big deal, and this is kind of largely based on sort of philosophical nitpicking. So for me, I think the thing with, and I'll kind of, I've written about Radek Faksa versus Jason Dickinson, and of course, gotta have my fancy charts, in part because my eyes don't remember, like, all 3 seasons of both these players, performance and on-ice actions. So, the eye test is not really going to work here if we're trying to condense, a career's worth of performance into one discussion. That's what salaries are for. Right? I think it's the ultimate irony, right? Which is that, like, now you can't wins above replacement war stats. You can't boil a player down to one number. We do all the time with salaries. So let's cut the crap. But anyways, so I'm not. The reason why I wasn't a big fan is because I think that, for one, I think, just to talk about Radek Faksa for a second, Faksa's, listen, like, he's a good player, and when he first started, I think, he was the check-in line 4. He was just like the prototype, just the quintessential, the ideal, just genetically engineered to be a check-in line center. And that's what Radek Faksa was. He can contribute offense and obviously play stout defensively. And, really kind of made his mark during the rough years with, sandwiched between Antoine Roussel and Ales Hemsky. And I think it's worth kind of going back to that particular line, because I think that, in retrospect, again, this is hindsight analysis. I can't say if it's true or not. I think in hindsight, there was a lot that Faksa, I think, really got from that line, which is things that maybe accentuated his strengths, but also kind of hid his flaws, which is that you had, in Roussel and Hemsky, and it's funny that Hemsky was a check-in line player because he doesn't profile like a check-in line forward. No one thinks of Ales Hemsky as Cal Clutterbuck with a little bit more flash. No, they just think of, like, Ales Hemsky as this kind of freelancer. And so that line was fantastic, and it was a big part of, especially, when I think it was the 2015-2016 season, where you had the quote-unquote Fackham line, which, by the way, I personally trademarked, but whatever. Nobody cares. It's not particularly clever. I just wanted to throw that out there. And I have receipts, by the way. Anyways, so I think the reason why it was so effective, and, I talk about this a lot, the idea of, like, interlinking skills over chemistry, because I think chemistry is just kind of seen as like it's just a rhetorical tool. It's like a lot of any other buzzword in hockey, like plays the right way and yada yada yada. It doesn't really mean anything. But to me, they had real skills. Like, Roussel was a guy that was fast, could occasionally finish plays, but just mostly just started some shit. And then Hemsky was a guy that just liked to freelance. And even though I don't think he necessarily had interlinking skill, like specific skills that paired well with Faksa and Roussel. Hemsky, I don't think was like a super creative passer or like great distributor or anything. What he did do, though, is he was so good at just zone entries, breaking into the zone, just single-handedly carrying the line into the zone to potentially make plays. And so you look at that line, and a lot of things just gelled well. And it's not like, and it's one of those things where there was a good reason not to keep it. And I think there's, just like any other player that's a bottom six player, these guys are replaceable. When you have a situation where maybe he does provide something very specific, well, that's what sort of cap and term is for, right? I mean, you try not to, give these guys too much. And if you do pay them a little bit more than they're worth, you do that within a window where you're going to get max value. And so I think with Radek Faksa, what happened is that, well, you had this system that favored the offensive part of his game and that surrounded him with offensive elements. And then, of course, the rough era ends. And one of the first things that happened, this is just like, I just find this the most loathsome thing well, I mean, not loathsome and just like I hate everything about it. It's just, then they bring in Hitchcock, which by all accounts wasn't really like a Jim Nill move. They bring in Hitchcock and they bring in Martin Hansel, right? So you already have, at the time, you had Sagan, Spezza, and Faksa. And one of the most bizarre things to me, I think, not bizarre, just dumb, just aggressively dumb, was, you know what? We need another center just like Faksa. And Faksa himself, he could play wing, fourth line. It feels like there was just no thought as to how Hansel's presence would affect everything else. It was again, goes back to one of my criticisms of like Jim Nill and the organization at large, which is kind of thinking in archetypes. This is the same organization that felt like Pulock had value. Why? Well, he's not good offensively, and he's big and can bench press a lot. He must be good defensively. And so I don't think a whole lot of thought was ever given to Hansel's effect on the rest of the roster. And sure enough, like Hitchcock did just absolutely just brain gravy stuff like, well, let's put Spezza on Hansel's wing. Let's put Faksa on Hansel's wing. None of it ever worked. Of course, it was never going to work, period. But nonetheless, that happened, which you kind of just write it off. And then we move into the quote-unquote FCC era. Listen, like, Cogliano and Como were strong defensive players. And I think that's worth pointing out. It's worth respecting. But, to the extent that Fax's game kind of declined, it kind of seemed to start there. And I think what we're looking at when we look at Faksa, and the reason why I'm talking about Faksa so much is that clearly this was a decision to trade Dickinson because they felt like they should keep Faksa. So kind of getting back to what I was saying, I think what happened here is that, so if you look at Faksa's wins above replacement, if you look at his goals above replacement, right? All these fancy stats that we use because, well, again, we can't use the eye test to like condense all, 3 seasons. Okay, I'm not going to, you know what? I apologize. I'm not going to go on a stats rant. But anyways, I do find a lot of value to what the numbers are telling us in this particular case because we already know the context, right? The last 3 seasons, Faksa was, sandwiched between 2 players that didn't provide offense, the total opposite of what he was used to. But what I think is interesting is that, yes, you can kind of write off last season as, well, he had a lingering wrist injuries. It's probably why he didn't really produce or wasn't as effective. But, the 2 seasons prior, like, Faksa's defense has been bad. His offense, also not good. And on the PK, he has struggled. He's struggled in particular, like, I think it's the right dot and the crease, where, like, shots just bleed through, right? And shots to the point as well, which is pretty critical. I mean, I don't think Faksa doesn't necessarily play the wedge, if I can recall, on the penalty kill. I don't know, I have to go back. Either way, like, he's struggled on the PK, right? So his defensive struggles cannot be explained away by, well, Cogliano and Como, because they were actually both good defensive players, not on the PK, except for Cogliano, but those have both been good defensive players. So you would think that Radek Faksa would benefit from that, and he doesn't. And he's And so he's struggled defensively. It's not just offense. He has struggled defensively over the last 3 seasons. Now, last 3 seasons are pretty unique for sure. But at the same time, these have also been within defensive systems. So to me, you cannot explain the last 3 seasons away as, well, Cogliano Como systems. Because if anything, those should benefit him. And so when I watch Faksa, I think part of kind of what I'm seeing beyond just, some of these numbers and kind of what they're showing us is, I think, a player who's defensive, who maybe had some defensive flaws, but that's not the system that he played in when he was at his best. When we had peak Faksa, we had a Radek Faksa who was, primarily like just, as much as coaches never admit this, but good defense via good offense. And I think that's largely what Faksa was able to accomplish. And so I think as these systems have kind of forced him into just dissolving into a defensive, brick in the wall, I think some of those defensive strengths that we never really saw as much are kind of, maybe revealing themselves. And I think Fax is still a good defensive center. I think the thing is that he's just a very meat and potatoes center, and which is totally fine. But I do think that the sort of some of what we've seen over Fax over the last 3 seasons maybe calls into question just how good he was defensively. And this is not a guy who can play wing like Jason Dickinson. So I think that's largely my argument for letting Faksa go, or what they should have done, right? Which was to expose Faksa or trade him, which you probably kind of could have got a better haul for. But it's neither here nor there. I just think that and I had a discussion on social media with a lot of really good people, right? So this is certainly nothing personal, no matter how sports mad I sound. And I think there's still room for, Faksa to grow. It's just that, listen, like, Bonus is coming back next year. Like, the system isn't going to change. Faksa is still going to be a feature on the PK, where he struggled. He's still going to be a feature at even strength, whether it's fourth line center, in which case he's not going to get fourth line minutes, or potentially wing, which could be interesting, but we've seen it before, and it didn't look good. And Faksa even admitted he hates playing wing. So I just don't see a scenario where you are somehow getting back, quote unquote, getting back Radek Faksa. And I don't know that it exists. I don't know that we have the clearest picture of Radek Faksa because of the drastically different systems he's played in and the different line mates. Because when Faksa has, had an established role, it's been for the long haul, right? Hemsky and Roussel, they were a feature for years. Como and Cogliano, they were a feature for years. Two completely competing philosophies. And so Radek Faksa is just not a guy that I think, even though he's young, he's not like young in terms of like peak performance. In fact, he's pretty much already beyond that. Again, if we're being like, strict like pocket protector nerds and be like, oh, well, peak production is technically like 25 and a half. No, of course not. And obviously I think some things are changing. I think players, I think we're seeing players, more capable of playing kind of beyond, beyond what's the typical like sort of aging curve for peak performance. And not just because we've seen it with like Pavelski and Radulov, but, we seem to kind of see it with other players as well. But anyways, so that's my whole thing with Radek Faksa. I don't think he's as essential as Dallas sees him. I don't think he's quite the player that we've come to know. And even if there was a world or a system in which he got to play something like what Ruff gave him, I'm not sure, like, to me, those were like as talented winger as you can get, in a bottom six role. And, Faksa like tops out as like 30 points. It's nothing special, but yet it's like $3+ million against the cap. And so getting back to kind of what I was getting back to Jason Dickinson, Dickinson's the complete opposite. Whereas Dickinson is a little bit of a mystery box. Of course, people might remember that, man, just Ken Hitchcock just did not like the kid. I don't know if they had maybe like political discussions and that was part of it, or what explained why Ken Hitchcock just refused to play Dickinson, who profiled like the kind of player you would expect Ken Hitchcock to like, age notwithstanding, of course. But, it's so weird how Nick Dickinson has been brought up because, he was also a player that was just phenomenal in the AHL as a five tools player. Great. I think he led the AHL. I don't know if it was his rookie year or 1 year. Led the AHL in shorthanded goals. I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember he was just fantastic on the PK. And when you look at using Top Down Hockey's wins above replacement model, which is an interesting model. Like if you're interested in fancy stats or or you think that kind of stuff has any value whatsoever, it is worth looking into because every model is different. And there's kind of the old quote. I can't remember the gentleman's name that it's something like all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? And so I think Top Down Hockey's model, if you're not going to get into a discussion about the difference between models and stuff like that, but it's probably like the model that I think is most at least like publicly available, that I think is kind of most valuable because it does take into account things like scorekeeper bias, where a lot of teams just are terrible at tracking where shots are coming from and stuff like that. But anyways, takes a lot of things into account, including prior probability, right? Like Mark Pesic, led the team in expected goals, I think, and obviously that's nonsense. Like any model should recognize that. Well, this is Mark Pesic we're talking about, and not like Ovechkin or whatever. So anyways, using that model and focusing purely on defense, even strength defense and so forth, Dickinson graded out as a top 15 forward. Strictly in a defensive capacity. So my thing with Jason Dickinson is not that I think like Jason Dickinson is a great player, because he's not. Like he's frustrating. I sometimes hate watching Dickinson just because he's a guy who he's kind of like he's a top six forward in a prize fighter's brain. This guy wants to sort of crash and bang. Kind of like what we saw with Ty Dellandrea, who just thought this was like the Broad Street era and just try to kind of hit everything in sight. And Dellandrea, I think, is going to be a good player. But and I think one of the reasons why it's like, losing Dickinson is not a big deal. You have, because not only do you have Ty Dellandrea, but you have some very potentially offensive capable centers like Maverick Bourque. And Frederick Karlstrom, who I think looks fascinating. He's going to be a really interesting prospect to watch, in addition to Jacob Peterson as well. So like Dallas has like a ton of really good centers with potential coming up. And so like I said, I don't mind this thing, but it's just like if you have that, then why not take the guy who seems to have some real offensive potential? And that's the thing about Dickinson. He's never really had a defined role. And this was, I made a point in the article that I wrote about between the two, which is that Dickinson is just never really had a defined role, but he's still managed to be effective. That's the thing that drives me absolutely nuts with like Faksa's numbers are awful. He gets caved in defensively, and the rejoinder is he plays tough competition. Okay, then why not play someone that might be effective against tough competition? Like, I mean, if somebody's struggling to play a certain role, then maybe give them another role. And that's where I think maybe there's kind of credence to the argument that, well, like, hey, like we should keep Faksa. Precisely because, like, well, if he is in a much more modest role, say like fourth line center, and maybe got like a little bit more offense, with him, then I don't know, maybe you have like a really, really solid player, or a different player, but still with the elements that we all like. But nonetheless, to me with Dickinson, I think you always err on the side of potential, and what the climate is maybe telling you. And look at the last 3 seasons for Dickinson, and defensively he's just been super strong. And when I watch him, it's like, as much as I get frustrated, All my frustrations are just in terms of offense, where he just has no distributed instinct whatsoever. Like he's gonna take the absolute like worst angle on the shot. He's gonna ignore the most obvious or best options for a pass. He's not really gonna use the middle unless it's that kitchen sink cross ice pass that Dallas seems to love. Because I think that was what okay, so this is like I can't believe my memories recalling this, but I distinctly remember, right, the year under Montgomery where Dallas was on that awful skid, lost like the first I think like 8 games, and they played Minnesota, and what got them out of that funk was not just a top tier sort of God of War performance by Radulov, but was just also luck. They were throwing a lot of pucks across the ice near the crease, and like pucks were just like bouncing off like skates and asses, and it was just like it was super random. But I always noticed that Dallas seemed to do that a lot afterwards, like trying to kind of recapture the magic. And that's kind of something that Jason Dickinson's good at, like throwing a random puck near the offensive zone and just rolling the dice. So I really don't think Dickinson really has untapped offensive potential. So that's not what this is about. It's not like I think that Dickinson's going to turn into like the next William Karlsson or Chandler Stevenson. But I also think we haven't seen, for as much as we talk about trying to kind of recapture the old Faksa magic, I also think maybe we haven't seen the best of Jason Dickinson. And he has, if you look purely at even strength points, like Dickinson is right there with Faksa. There's not much difference. And so I just, like I said, I just like to err on the side of kind of what the climate is telling us. In this case, hey, Dickinson seems great out as a really strong, a great defensive forward. Not much offense, still young, perhaps hasn't shown us, what he's truly capable of. So I just like to err on the side of like, potential and youth and also just less expensive. I mean, and maybe Dallas, like, well, I was going to say maybe Dallas kind of has something in the pipe for Radek Faksa. I just doubt it. I mean, it's hard to believe for a team that's trying to compete that they're just going to like trade Radek Faksa. But I do think it's one of those things that that would behoove them if they intend to roll with Hintz, Sagan, and Ben down the middle. And by all accounts, Bowness sounds committed to this. So I'm just like, okay, we were seriously going to pay our fourth line center like $3+ million? Like, I hope not. And I think that's my main thing. And especially, and this kind of ties back into kind of my criticism of why we kept Faksa over Dickinson, which is that if Radek Faksa plays a fourth line role, chances are like no matter what he's able to give you, what magic he can recapture, from his his rookie and sophomore years, you're probably not just going to get that just on sheer principle, just by ice time. And we'll see kind of how that works. Like we don't know anything about what the lines are going to look like, but like I said, I don't understand why. To me, when I talk about kind of the philosophy of the team, it just goes back to, for example, like the Nichushkin thing, right? Where when it comes to evaluating players against expectation and against what's not there as opposed to what is there, Dallas is always going to pick the safest option. Like, and the thing with Nichushkin, and yes, there's a lot of stuff with Nichushkin that, kind of surrounds that decision, but I have no doubt that for Dallas themselves, right, like they saw Nichushkin as a player they expected to produce offense. He didn't. And so when he didn't, they could not possibly see how Nichushkin would provide any other value, even though, like, yes, we've seen Nichushkin turn into a fantastic defensive forward. But they started to see that in Montgomery's, they started to see that in Nichushkin's last season, where he was actually playing on the PK as well. So obviously they have some idea, but again, like it's just kind of one of those things where I don't think this is a philosophy that is going to affect not just like choosing between Dickinson and Faksa, but also future decisions. You look at like stuff like the John Klingberg contract coming up, and I have no doubt that they'll probably lose Klingberg for nothing. Assuming all things being equal, probably lose Klingberg. And people are going to say, well, they couldn't bring Klingberg back because of Heiskam's contract, and well, we have an internal replacement in Thomas Harley, which is just nonsense. Like, Harley and Klingberg are two different players, and they provide very different things, even though they fit within a quote-unquote archetype. Doesn't matter. What's going to push Klingberg out is Lindell's contract. Like, here's a guy that is basically paid because he was the dude standing next to the stud. And I think Esa Lindell has plenty of value on his own. But in proportion to his cap, no. No. Not even close. Look at if we want to talk about like Tampa Bay and following the blueprint, they pay Hedman and they pay McDonough. They do not pay Eric Cernak and Jan Rutta, both of whom don't make like $4 million plus. Like, they don't make that much. So for Dallas to pay a guy like Esa Lindell so much, I mean, this is getting off topic, and I don't want to talk too much about the defense because I want to focus on kind of like most of the news. But just that, like, I worry that this particular decision reflects future decisions as it has past decisions, and we see, and Dallas is one of the few teams that doesn't have a dedicated data specialist, doesn't have a dedicated analytics team. Their analytics is devoted to Mark Janko, Sam Lights, and I think Alex Lepore, who all have other duties. Like, Lepore and Lights are scouts, and then Janko is, of course, an assistant general manager. And the reason why I bring that up is because that was actually one of the decisions that Colorado had to, they had to have an internal discussion. When Sean Shapiro kind of talked about this and kind of why they chose Nichushkin, the scouts largely didn't like Nichushkin, but their internal analytics and other people in the organization felt like, hey, there's all the signs are there that this player is going to bounce back and has value despite how he looks, despite the archetype that you assume he would fall in. And so those are the kind of discussions that I have no faith that Dallas actively has. And that's not like a criticism of like, well, Dallas is a shitty team. Like they're backwards and they're not progressive, and they're just like these guys are, you have Don Cherry types. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think these small things do make a difference. And when you're talking about elite teams, I think those margins are critical. That extra 2%. Like, there's a reason why a team like Tampa is so successful and has been successful. I would say Tampa is just one of the best teams of the last like 30, 40 years, because they've been so consistent for so long. Like, this is a team that had been to the finals before they won 2 cups. And the one time they missed the playoffs over the last like 7, 8 years was because they had like a rash of injuries. And they did things like bring in a proper data specialist who came from the Cleveland Indians, Barb Underhill, who really, worked with prospects and players to improve their skating, which benefited Braden Point in a huge way. And, some of this is, I'm kind of retreading material that I've kind of written. So I apologize for that. I'm not trying to be redundant or, say the same things I have. The reason why I'm doing this is because I feel like I'm, covering material that I haven't written about. But like I said, I think the philosophy is everything. And I think what it reflects is what I think hurts the team more than, the actual kind of, value that was exchanged between Dickinson and the and the third round pick. So that's my whole thing. Anyways, in terms of like general expansion thoughts and kind of some of the other stuff with like Bishop, it sounds like there was just like good stuff, like a really like honorable, like solid move on Bishop's part. So there's not a whole lot to report. I think, best case scenario would be if Seattle somehow takes Bishop, which could be beneficial, because one, if he is healthy, then you have an elite goaltender. And in addition to that, you have an elite goaltender that's not going to be on the cap for very much longer. And it's not like Bishop is, it's not like Bishop has something like the Price contract, Carey Price, of course. So, Dallas being able to expose Bishop is pretty interesting. And that would be, I think, Dallas's best case scenario if they take Bishop, which could make some sense. Also because, well, if Bishop is not healthy, then this is, cap they can quote unquote hide. So there are a lot of good reasons to take Bishop. And even though I don't think Seattle is going to do anything close to kind of what Vegas did, I think Seattle is kind of looking more sort of long term because I think they recognize that Vegas largely caught lightning in a bottle. It's important to remember that Vegas didn't look like a good team. William Karlsson, there was no evidence that he could have the season that he did. And same thing with Marc-Andre Fleury. Like here was a veteran goaltender. Very good reputation, but turned into just like an elite performer, and Gerard Gallant just somehow got the absolute most out of this kind of ragtag group. So I think Seattle kind of recognizes that this is not something that we'll be able to kind of necessarily do, but at the same time, I don't think they're going to complain if they can be competitive the first season out. They're not going to complain if all of a sudden they just have something like Vegas, and maybe there's something to the fact that, well, just modern expansion rules really benefit expansion teams. We're not talking about the Atlanta Thrashers days. So that would be huge, man, if Dallas could do that, because then all of a sudden they have stuff like Blake Coleman money. Even though I've talked about Blake Coleman before, I don't think he's as essential. I think Dallas has some very specific needs, and I think it would behoove Jim Nill to look at his roster and just identify what he needs. Forget about like whether or not you can bring in more veteran presence and blah, blah, blah. No, you need a strong penalty killing forward, which they really don't have. They are going to let Cogliano go, who was like the one forward on the PK that was actually really good. And then they traded away Dickinson. Faksa and Como have been bad on the PK. That's what kills me about these decisions. It's like the opposite of those little sort of margins, those little differences, man. Like, I can't stress this enough. Like, I thought I wasn't going to get sports mad, but maybe I am. But they need a strong penalty killing forward. They need which I think is low priority. They need a decent even strength goal scoring forward, which I think is medium priority. And I think they really need a strong penalty killing defenseman, which I personally think is high priority. And that's why I've always argued for Seth Jones. And I think a Seth Jones for S. Lindell trade would make sense because Columbus would get back what they lost, quote unquote, as in a top four defenseman. But this one is signed to term, so they don't have to worry about whose no movement clause is going to kick in eventually. So they don't have to worry about trying to replace Seth Jones and maybe get some like a center or something out of it. So and of course, like I said, Dallas is going to be put to the test no matter what after next year, because you don't technically lose, but all things being equal, you lose Radulov, you lose Pavelski, and Klingberg could go to free agency. So, and I think there's every reason to believe that Seth Jones had no problem re-signing with Dallas if the team was competitive. Just because, he was born in Arlington, so he gets to be back home. Sources like Pierre LeBrun have kind of talked about how, like, sort of, it sounds like Dallas is a team that is a potential wild card in the Seth Jones sweepstakes, but mostly that Seth Jones has seemed to kind of mentioned that, there are only a couple teams that he would sign an extension with, Dallas being one of them. So I don't think there would be any trouble with Dallas bringing back Seth Jones if they signed him, traded S. Lindell, and all that would leave would just be a side on the left spot, which I think you can get with someone like Alex Edler, who has been really strong defensively over the last 3 seasons, which is odd because, he's an aging veteran, and he's kind of been bounced, around the lineup defensively as, Vancouver's made a lot of changes. I think he was mostly with Nate Schmidt this year, but last year was like Stetcher and Myers, who, aren't great or anything like that. So I think it would just be much easier to fill in that left spot, in addition to the fact that you have Thomas Harley, who a lot of people, talk about like, well, Harley's the Klingberg replacement. No, he's a top four. They see him as a top four defenseman. So if he plays in Dallas, it's going to be as a top four defenseman. Otherwise, it's just like a wasted pick. But nonetheless, like, listen, like I'm not saying like they should bank on like Thomas Harley fitting right next to John Klingberg. Although they could always put Sekera next to Klingberg, who I think were okay as a defensive pair. I'll have to kind of look back. They didn't spend a whole lot of time together, so it doesn't really matter, even if they did. But nonetheless, it's like, I mean, you bring in, like, to me, man, if you traded Lindell for Jones, had Heiskanen Jones, and say like Edler, Klingberg, and then like Harley and Sekera as your top 6 defense, that would be an excellent top 6. And I think you're looking at a really good team, even if they don't make any moves offensively, because I do think that if they roll with that 3 center, the sort of Hintz, Sagan, Ben down the middle, I mean, honestly, like, as my criticism with Dallas's offense has always been that the system stupid. And I think that's I think a worthwhile catchphrase. It's the system stupid. And if you look at the so Micah Blake McCurdy on his HockeyViz website has kind of a really unique little sort of HockeyViz, which is coach and impact. And as you might expect, to the extent if you find, and you may not consider this like a valid model to begin with, but if you do, it is worth noting that, or if you think it's looking into, it is worth noting that bonus has a very negative impact on the team. And so, at least offensively, right? We've seen kind of what he's able to do defensively. But to me, the point here is that, like, I honestly think that if the system opened up, like, Dallas has the offense to be, at minimum, an average goal-scoring team. I mean, you have Hintz and Robertson who've taken over the Ben and Sagan roles. You still have Ben and Sagan. And you have Radulov, you have Pavelski, you have Gurionov, you have Kiviranta, you have a ton of players that probably have the potential to play a middle 6 role. Maybe not Maverick Bourque, but like for sure Riley Damiani, maybe Adam Mascarin. There's just no reason why Dallas should score as little as they do. And I think it's just largely the system. So I don't think like Dallas's goal scoring needs to be filled with just some random expensive veteran. I think it's just the system needs to open up, and that's kind of the thing, like I think that, Dallas needs to be a team that, they can't go with this, we're look how cool it was to see the Islanders and Montreal do so well. That's what it takes to be successful. Who gives a shit? Who cares? Like, do you want to be the players that lose in the playoffs, or do you want to be the teams that lose in the playoffs, or do you want to be the teams that get to celebrate with beer and say obnoxious things that everybody hates? The latter sounds bad, but that's what teams want to be. So, I mean, Dallas needs to look at this in terms of, hey, how can we be cup winners? How can we be cup threats? Not, how can we be the plucky underdogs that everybody roots for? Because, yeah, sure, sometimes those teams win, but very rarely. The last, 10 cup winners, only 2 of them were not returning or future champs. So I really feel like this is the season that Nil needs to make a bold move, and it looks like the table's set. If Jim Nil wants to do something that's going to take this franchise to the next level, this is his opportunity. Because as we've seen with teams like Minnesota, I mean, and other teams teams are doing some crazy stuff. And so if Dallas wanted to trade for Seth Jones, I think they could easily make it happen. If they wanted to trade for something else, wanted to make some other move, whatever. I mean, I think this is just the season they can do it. But anyways, I've talked for too long about expansion thoughts. I don't really think it talked about expansion. I think it was just mostly Faksa and Dickinson. But nonetheless, I appreciate you guys, hanging out with me. And I don't really know where to go from here. This is just the worst outro. Anyways, you guys are fantastic. I always like doing these, and I'll certainly be doing more as more news breaks. I kind of want to do a draft episode as well, because I have been paying attention to the picks, and I've written about prospects before, so I'm certainly no expert, but whatever. I will definitely do some draft stuff, and yeah, man, appreciate you guys hanging out, and hope you guys enjoy this and have a great one.